We're going. So thanks for joining us again, guys. Part 3 of our Standing on the Shoulder of Giants here. Chapman's going to do a little bit of a review for those that haven't seen these before, but we didn't really know where this was going to go, but it led us to what the people wanted, which was another part of Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. So pretty excited. We have another panel member as well joining in. We're going to hear some from him, Ed McNeely, and maybe fill in some gaps that were occurring in some of the other 5 panel members. So I'm going to pass it over to Chaps and hang back and listen. Thanks, Chaps.
Thanks, Sam. Not too much to add, team. Part 3, as we said, we didn't think we'd be getting this far, but combos just kept going, and I still have a laundry list of questions. And we also have a new combatant entering the ring. Mr. Ed McNeely's name came up a few times in the first one, so we thought we'd get him on to tell his story. And yeah, I said, let's just toss it over to Ed. We're learning from the OGs of Ontario strength and conditioning. So let's throw one more in the mix. Off to you, Ed.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Where is it? Right here. So I've got a bit of a PowerPoint here. It doesn't really have a real flow to it. So I was, wondering if I should, do this chronologically, and that was just turning into a whole lot of work, and the discovery that pre-digital cameras, I don't really have a lot of photos. They're all sitting in boxes someplace. So this is going to bounce around a little bit, and it's just really more going to be a discussion of kind of some of the key influences and some of the, kind of highlights of my career. And essentially this all started at the University of Ottawa, and I was there from 86 through 1994, doing both undergrad and graduate work. At that time, there really wasn't a lot of a discussion around S&C as a profession. And we were treating everything more as sports science. One of my main mentors through those early years was Al Reed, who was one of the profs at Ottawa U. And he had always said that, you need to be well-versed and have a high level of competence across all of the disciplines that make up sports science if you're going to work as a sports scientist. So that meant physiology, biomechanics, sports psych, nutrition, strength and conditioning. Although at that time, strength and conditioning was really looked at as more, it was a combination of, it was the practical arm of a lot of the physiology and biomechanics. My undergrad was in phys ed, which I think was actually a really a useful thing, because it gave me a lot more freedom as far as what happened in the program. I think that emphasis on education and teaching and coaching that you get through a phys ed program becomes very valuable. But at the same time, when I originally went into this, I went in with the notion of coming out of it to teach phys ed, because my dad had been a phys ed teacher. And one of the nice things about the phys ed program was you had to have what was called a second teachable subject. So you would do a minor in something, and my minor ended up being in science. So I did a lot of biochemistries, I did a lot of chemistries, I did a lot of biology courses as kind of, with the original plan of thinking about going into teaching, it was that second teachable subject for me would have been science. But somewhere along the way, I think it was probably in my 3rd year, when I started getting exposure to the sports science courses and physiology courses in particular, I decided that that was the direction we were going to go. And that's when I kind of hooked up. There was a group working out of the University of Ottawa at that time under Al Reed that had contracts with a bunch of the different national teams. So this is at a time when there really wasn't a lot of sports science support going on for national sport organizations. but it was just getting started. And it was getting started as a result of our abysmal performance at the '88 Winter Olympics. So, you know, we come away with no gold medals and what, 2 or 3 medals in the whole games. And as a result of that, Sport Canada was starting to look at, you know, bringing sports science more to the forefront with the different national sport organizations. So they started a program called the Sports Science Support Program. And NSOs could apply for money to access sports science services. And there were 3 centers that were kind of being funded to provide those services at that point in time. And sports were free to choose whoever they wanted, but you know, most were going through one of 3 centers, and that was us at the University of Ottawa, it was University of Calgary, and it was UVic. And there wasn't a lot of money in the system. In fact, if you look at it now, I think the total amount of money in the whole system was less than, you know, probably half of what a tier 1 sport gets right now in a single year. So it became difficult to, you know, really make a full living off of this without having a lot of different sports to deal with. And so this group I was part of, we formed this, or it became this unit as part of the University of Ottawa called the Human Kinetics Assessment Center. And we had a whole lot of NSOs that we were working with. So this is just a list of the senior national teams that we were working with through kind of that mid-90s period in there. And the reason we had so many more was we were running a model that was a decentralized model. So there were very few sports that were actually centralized into any training venues or training centers at that time, and they were completely decentralized, both from a technical, tactical, you know, sport standpoint, as well as from any kind of support work that they were doing. So we would travel, and that was our model. Is as grad students at the time at Ottawa U, when we were going through this, there was 2 of us that would do a lot of travel, and we would put together trips. And we might be gone a month or 6 weeks at a time, and we would just start at one side of the country, and you know, we would do some work in Ottawa, and then there might be a stop in London to do some rowing stuff, or Windsor to do some baseball stuff, and then move on to Winnipeg to do some badminton stuff in Winnipeg, move into Calgary where we would do cross-country skiing, badminton, alpine skiing. You know, we would do altitude camps on the glaciers just outside of Canmore at that time. Then we'd go on to Vancouver and pick up some stuff there, and then finish off in Victoria. Again, pick up some triathletes, rowers, and then fly back to Ottawa. And this would be, you know, we would do that 3 or 4 times a year. And it made it affordable for sports because it would be, they would share the cost of doing this, as opposed to, you know, having to fly somebody out, fly somebody back, all on their own dime. So we had a lot of these sports that we were working with. We were spending you know, a good chunk of time traveling, servicing these sports. And again, this was covering across all sports science disciplines. So when you go in, you're doing a combination of, you know, physiology, biomechanics, S&C, you know, some sports psych, some nutrition, all thrown into the mix in there. At the same time, you know, we couldn't make money. Even with that many NSOs, it became difficult to, you know, really be able to make any money. So we picked up some pro sport stuff as well over the course of my career. I worked with the Senators, the Ottawa Rough Riders, the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And again, a lot of this was sports science support directly to, in many cases, supporting the S&C coaches that were already in place in some of these organizations. I've also spent a lot of time doing occupational stuff. And so I've worked with the RCMP on a couple of different tasks. CERT was their emergency response team, as well as doing a validation of their PAIR test, which is their general entry fitness test. Worked with the Ontario Ministry of Health to develop fitness tests and fitness standards for EMTs. BNR Northern Telecom, so that was Bell Northern Research Northern Telecom. So Ottawa was always a hotbed of high-tech companies. And a lot of these companies that were manufacturing their own chips and stuff like that, semiconductors, etc., because of the chemicals that they use, they had to have their own on-site emergency response teams because police and fire wouldn't be able to get there quickly enough in the event of a lot of spills that might happen. So we were, again, developing emergency fitness standards for emergency response teams. We did the same thing in correctional services, Parks Canada, worked with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, again, developing tests and standards for all of the response officers, the guys working at all the nuclear plants, all of the guards, et cetera, at the nuclear plants. And then I've spent a significant amount of time through my career working in, Canadian and American colleges and universities. And so all of this is really, it kind of, for me, highlights, in the beginning, this need to reach out and have multiple streams of income simply because there wasn't the opportunities available for somebody to work full-time with a single sport or with a single university, college, etc. at that time. So you had to spend a lot of time going out and piecing things together over time. And so a big chunk of my career, as being a self-employed person in this, has really been getting out and touching on a lot of these different areas. And what's been really interesting about it is the experiences are all so different. It's a very different thing when you are dealing with, NSOs versus, occupational stuff versus colleges and universities. And I think it's really, I've taken things from each of those that allowed me to go back and be better every time I went back into those different scenarios. It's a completely different mindset when you're working with, prison guards than it is when you're trying to work with somebody who's training for an Olympic Games. And so I think that a variety of experiences is something that's really important for an SMC coach to develop. And, I would definitely recommend to anybody that you don't want to spend your career doing one thing and the same thing all the time. If you can get out and you can, get experiences across a lot of different levels of sport, a lot of different types of S&C, and even just looking at the activities that you do within these things. In some cases, I was doing just strength and conditioning stuff with some of these various teams, etc. In other cases, it was more physiology stuff. Sometimes it was nutrition stuff. Sometimes it's the combination of the whole thing. And so I think it's important, I would always suggest, and I do suggest this to people, that, if you get the opportunity to go and get something different, something that's done outside of sport, you're going to get a lot of value out of it. Just because it gives you a different perspective and it gives you a new perspective and a new way of thinking about how you go about doing things. This is Miriam Bernard. And the reason she's in here is she is the first medalist that I ever worked with. And she was a medalist in '92 and then a double medalist in '94. And she's one of the people, being one of the first medalists you work with, and you really come to appreciate when you meet somebody like this that is that successful in their sport. You can really come to appreciate the difference between those people that are winning medals and those people that are going to an Olympic Games. And there's a big difference. Just the mindset and the approach and the professionalism that they bring to their sport, their attention to detail. And with her in particular, what was a big learning for me from this is she would constantly ask questions and challenge everything until she had an answer she was satisfied with. She wasn't going to do anything in her program until she was 100% satisfied that it was the best thing for her program. So it really forced me to be able to justify. And this is actually something, I saw the same thing with, Marnie McBean was the same way, Silken Laumann was the same way. Any of these medalists very often are the same way, particularly in the more individually related sports, that, they're not going to sit back and accept what their coach says. They're not going to sit back and accept what their S&C coach is saying or their physiologist or anybody unless you've got an explanation for what's going on. They look at this as they understand that, this is their career. They have a short window of time where they can take advantage of, an Olympic success, or they've only got 1 or 2 shots at an Olympic Games, and they want to make sure that everything is in place. And that's really been one of the things I've noticed over the years with all of the medalists that I've worked with, is that that's a common thing. As I said, compared to somebody that's going to an Olympics, compared to somebody that's never going to get to an Olympics, there is a difference in the approach that these athletes take. And as S&C coaches, that's something we have to respect. And we can't go in just thinking that I'm going to give you a program and you're going to do it because I'm an expert and I said so. If you don't have a good rationale behind what you're doing, if you don't have a model for what you're doing, and if you don't have a story for how and why this is going to work, these athletes are never going to buy into it because it is different. The Olympics is different than any other sporting event that they're going to go to. And those athletes that actually step up and win medals at Olympics are different as well. Interestingly, I actually stepped away. Well, I didn't really step away. I reduced the amount of time that I was spending doing direct S&C stuff for a period of about 4 years. Now, during this time, I still continued I worked with Rowing Canada for 24 years. And so in the background of all of this, they were always a sport that I was doing a lot of work with, whether it was, right from the national team through the provincial teams down to the clubs. But I took this 4-year period and I actually went down and worked for Human Kinetics Publishers down in Champaign, Illinois. And part of the reason for that was my belief that our biggest role, and if you're self-employed in this, you have to be able to communicate information and technical information effectively. You've got to be able to get this out to the end users. So it's one thing to sit down and write an academic paper and publish it in a journal that 1,000 people are going to read. It's a completely other thing when you're trying to sell a book that you're trying to get into tens of thousands of people, or you're trying to write something for a magazine where there might be 6 or 7 million people looking at it. And so I decided to take this risk, move down, get a job at Human Kinetics, just really to learn about how to package information. So how can you take information, how can you package information most effectively so that you are really taking into consideration what the end user wants, not what you want to present, but what they want to see. And I think too often, the mistake, and I know it was a mistake that I made in some of the early writing that I had done and some of the early presentations and things that I had done was, I'm presenting what I want as opposed to presenting or writing about what the end user wants and taking that end user into account first. Being able to sit back and think about what is their level of literacy, what is their level of numeracy, how do we package this information, how much information are we giving, what information is actually relevant in the end. Are we putting a whole lot of filler in there that isn't relevant to anything to fill pages? or are we actually getting out there and getting right to the point of what we are trying to talk about? So it was a really great experience being down there, learning about, in this industry, how do we package information? Because that's what it's all about. Everything we've got, whether you're writing a program, doing a presentation, writing an article, it's all about information and all about communicating information. And so that was a big move for me to, go down to Champaign. Again, being down in the Midwest in the US is, culturally is quite different than Canada. And it was also occurring at around that whole 9/11 time too. So that was just kind of a unique experience all on its own. But the nice thing about human kinetics was it also opened up so many doors. There were so many really good coaches, S&C coaches, sports science people, etc., that I met as a result of doing that job. And so it really became a great networking opportunity as well. I really looked at it. It was also this 4-year networking opportunity that, got me in front of so many people that I was able to learn from as we went along. It also led to not just the human kinetics stuff, but all of that national team work and everything that I had done led me to a place in my career coming out of the human kinetics stuff where I was focusing a lot more on education and providing education. And it actually led to a lot of travel. I ended up going out and working with a lot of different Olympic associations in, various countries. So spent a little bit of time in Lebanon. And again, this was lectures for a lot of their, coaching groups that were there. And we were being brought over by the Olympic committees to do some of this coaching. We were down in Antigua and Barbuda as well. And we actually had the opportunity at that point to work with, so that photo up on the left there was the coaching group that we were working with. But at the same time, we went back and did a little occupational stuff as well. So we were down there for about 3 weeks. And, you really can't complain about, going down to the Caribbean on an all expense paid, 3-week work tour isn't a bad way to spend 3 weeks. But, we spent 2 weeks with the Olympic Committee's coaches, and then we spent a week doing some stuff with their police forces. And, the island is a pretty small island. And so we ended up, don't have a lot of facilities. And this was kind of really the interesting thing in some of this travel that I've done is, Lebanon doesn't have great sport facilities, or at the time didn't have great sport facilities. Very little in the way of sport facilities in Antigua and Barbuda. I spent some time in China as well. And, it was interesting with China. This was a 3-week thing that was sponsored by the NSCA. And so there was myself and Jay Dawes. I don't know if any of you would know him, but we went over on behalf of the NSCA, and we spent 2 weeks down in Wuhan, which has become more famous now for this pandemic that we're all in than anything else. But we were at one of the sports schools in Wuhan for 2 weeks, and then we were up in Beijing for a week. And the sports schools down there are basically the equivalent of a human kinetics department in our university here in Canada, with the difference that there's 35,000 students. So if you think about the number of students you've got in some of your, classes you may be teaching or something like that, and then probably multiply it by, several hundred times to get the size of, some of the classes that were there. But we were brought in to work with this group. There was actually, this is half of the group here. We couldn't fit everybody in one photo, so we ended up taking the same photo twice with different coaches being subbed into it. But when we look at even their facilities, it's really not what most people would sit back and classify as world-class facilities. And this is really, for me, this was interesting because especially now where there seems to be such an emphasis on facilities and the quality of the facilities and the equipment and everything else. And if you look at this, these were actually these were some of their national training centers. So the university in Wuhan was a national training center for table tennis, badminton, and weightlifting. And it really isn't what you would consider impressive facilities. But what was really interesting is they spent a lot of time and they made a lot of investment in people. So they weren't putting their money into facilities, they were putting their money into people. Doing a lot of coach education stuff, trying to do, a lot of PD stuff for their coaches, a lot of PD stuff around various staff and things like that. And the investment in people, and it's something that China's got no shortage of people. And I think they really take advantage of that. And I think it's a real lesson for us in North America, where there always seems to be this arms race as to who has got the best equipment, who has got the most equipment, who has got the newest equipment. That if you don't put the people in place first, it doesn't matter what equipment you've got. It's not going to make the difference in what's going on. This is just where we were actually using the bleachers in one of the gyms. Was the only place that was big enough to house the group of coaches that we were there. And what was really interesting about this, and it was the same thing that happened in Lebanon as well. Any lectures had to be translated because my Chinese isn't great. And for most of these people, they don't speak English. They have no need to speak English. So the guy, you can see the Jay Dawes is the guy in the blue shirt, and the other guy was our translator, who was, one of our hosts as well. And it was always a funny thing during these talks that you might stand up there and talk for 5 seconds, say 3 words, and then he goes on for like 2 minutes. And then there would be other times where you might stand up there and you go through 3 or 4 minutes of speaking, and then he says 3 words. And so we never really knew if what we were saying is what was actually being said to the audience itself. But what I really learned from this experience over here, and as I said, both the same in Lebanon and here in China, a complete language barrier. Like we could not speak to these people in their native language. But we spent a lot of the time, a lot of the stuff we would do would be active. So we would get everybody up out of the stands onto the gym floor, doing things, going through different types of drills and exercises and stuff like that. And it really emphasized the power of play. And this was something that Greg McKelvey, who had been one of my profs at the University of Ottawa, had always talked about. And play is really a universal language. When you get people up and you get people doing things, it strips away all of the cultural differences. And we see that getting out there and doing sport, being involved in these activities, you don't really need to be able to communicate in the same language to do that. It's easy enough to do a demo. They can figure out some hand signals that you're trying to give to them. But, it was fascinating and amazing to see, everybody is up out of their seats. They're laughing, they're enjoying themselves, they're going through this process, and it really shows you the power of play. And it really reinforces the reason I think that many of us got into this, and the reason that our athletes got into this as well. You know, they got into these sports that we're dealing with because they love to do it. And many times this really forced me to kind of, look at that again. And it reminded me that, sometimes we've got to take this step back and not be so serious in everything that we're doing, because what we are doing is, it is games. It is games, it is play that we are doing. And we don't want to be sucking as support professionals in sport. We don't want to be sucking the fun out of sport for our athletes. And I think we've always got to keep that at the back of our mind, that, when they stop enjoying doing what they're doing, they're going to stop buying into what we're asking them to do as well. Got lucky again to go to the Netherlands, again with the NSCA. We went to Papendal, which is their Olympic training center down there, for the European conference. So this was one the NSCA had started putting on every year. And they would just bring people from around the world into, basically an S&C conference at somewhere in Europe. So this was the NSCA's, one of the earliest NSCA European conferences. And what was really kind of fun about this was, again, being able to see a different approach, this European approach to their preparation. So they had pretty good facilities in here, but what many of these European countries really have going for them is such a small footprint in the world. Like, their geography is very small, so that it becomes very easy for them to start bringing people into these centralized locations. So you can have something that is a decentralized program, but it's actually fairly easy for them to centralize on a regular basis, because everybody can hop a train and be wherever they want to be within a couple of hours. So another interesting part of my career, and this actually came back out of, this all started coming out of the work I was doing down at Human Kinetics. As part of my job at Human Kinetics, I went out to a conference in Spokane, Washington. And I reconnected with somebody I had done my undergrad work with, David Sandler, who is in the middle of that Strength Pro Summit picture down there. So Dave and I had done our undergrads together. Dave had been a competitive power lifter. I was competing in weightlifting at that time. Dave was competing in powerlifting. He had been I think he was a junior world record holder in the bench press. He had done a 230 kilo bench at a body weight of 181, I think was the weight category. So he would have been he actually would have been probably a world-class power lifter if he didn't have stenosis all up and down his spine. And so really he ended up in a position where the only stuff he could do was bench, and he just got really good at bench. But I reconnected with him, and we had a little bit of a personal training business going on our last year of undergrad. And we just, basically went back to doing what we had been doing before almost. And we created this company called Strength Pro. And Strength Pro was really, it was kind of a holding company where if we were going to do some things together, it was just someplace where we could throw the money. And we started again with the connections he had. He was doing his PhD at University of Miami at the time. And the connections I was making through Human Kinetics, we started getting these various opportunities coming up. And one of them was And it tied into a lot of the stuff I had been learning through human kinetics, etc. Is we got this opportunity to put on a strength and conditioning conference at the Arnold Fitness Expo. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to go down to the Arnold, but it's a pretty impressive weekend. And it's something I would suggest anybody that's working in this field needs to do at least once. It is a bigger sport festival than the Olympics is. There are more athletes that will compete at the Arnold in a weekend than will compete at the Olympic Games over a 2-week period. So there's 10,000 and some athletes across a whole variety of sports. You know, you'll get all of the strength sports in there. So there will be, you know, there's always a weightlifting competition, a couple of powerlifting competitions, various levels of strongman competitions, bodybuilding, fitness figure, ballroom dance, gymnastics, table tennis, archery. They have a 5K run that's part of this. And it's just huge. It gives a lot of, they try to give a lot of smaller sports a stage to show people what they're all about. And so we had this opportunity to start putting together this strength summit up there. And we started thinking about, okay, what do we want out of this? And what we came to was we wanted something that featured not just researchers, not just S&C coaches, but we also wanted to start bringing in some of these top competitors and learning from the experiences that athletes in some of these strength sports have had. So we were getting people coming in there, you know, like in this slide here, top left corner, that's Louis Simmons from Westside. He would come in and do some talks for us. Brad Gillingham in the middle was a regular presenter for us. On the right in the top row was Harvey Newton, who was a former U.S. national team weightlifting coach. Bill Kazmaier down on the bottom. Jay Hoffman, who, you know, he's an academic, and the same with Joey Antonio is an academic as well. And every year we would try to bring in this broad spectrum of people that we knew, people that we got to know across different parts of, you know, this industry that we're in. And we would purposely bring people in that we knew would disagree with each other. You know, in the first year that we were in there, I don't have a photo up here, but, you know, again, we had Louis, who was representing kind of a powerlifting side. We had Harvey, who was representing kind of the weightlifting approach to this. We would have, you know, people that were coming in with a strongman background, but we would also be bringing in people from, we had John Philbin, who was former strength and conditioning coach with the Washington Redskins. And what was unique about him is he and the 3 or 4 others in the NFL around that time were all using HIIT training. And not the interval type HIIT training, but basically that Nautilus system that Arthur Jones had developed kind of HIIT training. And so we would bring in these people, and really the idea was to get as many different perspectives on what we do in S&C as we possibly can. Because I think too often we pigeonhole ourselves down, you know, one route or another, and we let our biases really, or we develop these biases towards one type of training. And we wanted a conference where we could get a huge number of varying opinions and varying different ideas around what constituted training. As a result of this, and we put this conference on for, you know, I think it was probably 7 years or so that we did this. And we would bring different people in, and, you know, every year to really try to keep some variety in there. But as a result of some of the contacts that we made out of this, another piece of my career really came around we developed a supplement line at one point in time. And we were actually the first to market with beta-alanine supplements. And we were doing pretty well with our supplements up until about 2008. And 2008, when there was the whole, market crash, financial crisis, and everything else, basically all of our customers dried up. And then that ended up being the end of our supplement business. Spent some time with sledge hockey, 2004 to 2010. And this was really interesting because I had done some para work earlier on with wheelchair basketball years before, but it was very sporadic because as an association, they really didn't have any money at that time. And so we were pretty limited in what we did with them. But sledge hockey had just come under the auspices of Hockey Canada in 2004. And so they were kind of getting the full Hockey Canada treatment at that point in time with, all the sort of support. And there were some real lessons around, being able to adapt what you want to do with training to meet the abilities of the athletes that you're dealing with. And this was a really, good group of guys to work with, that they would work hard. They appreciated what was being done for them because they had never really had anything before. And, it was as I said, my first real experience in a para sport situation. And it's definitely something I would recommend to anybody. Like, very often people will look at para sports as being kind of, well, that's not really high performance sport, but these guys would work as hard and were willing to work as hard as any other NSO athletes that I have dealt with in the past. Some of them have just never had the opportunity to do it. There wasn't the innate culture around the sport for a lot of this stuff. So it really provides that opportunity for, to work on developing the culture in the sport itself. The other interesting thing that happens with this is you really get the reinforcement in, with a sport like this, of ultimately what becomes important. Because sometimes when you're dealing with para sport, and we saw this a lot, or we saw this in the sledge hockey group anyway, was a lot of the guys were there because they'd lost a limb due to cancer or something. And in that year leading into 2010, we actually lost 2 guys as a result of that cancer coming back. So it really makes you sit back and think about what is important, in the whole world of sport. It gives you a good lesson and gives you a good grounding that, you know what, there are things that are a lot more important than what our training program looks like, or even how the team performs. So coming into 2008, I was doing a lot more sports stuff at this time. We had a pretty good Olympics in 2008 with bronze medals out of both of the lightweight programs. And this was actually the first time that Canadian lightweight women had won a medal at the Olympics. So the 2008 Olympics was the first time the Canadian lightweight women had done it. Lightweight men had done it. This was, I think, only the second time they had ever medaled at an Olympic Games. And this was a really interesting group because the whole idea of making weight and getting down to weight categories while still trying to improve performance was a big part of what we were focusing on at this point in time. So this really came to the front. It brought to the front that need to have skills around more than just one discipline. Because up till this time, so from everything we've talked about from the early 90s right on through, in most of these cases, there weren't integrated support teams in place, because integrated support teams didn't really exist in Canada at that point. If you were coming in and you were working with a sport, you were expected to be able to do multiple or provide multiple services. There weren't a lot of support teams in the way that support teams are now currently composed. You know, you had to really, you know, be able to handle a lot of this stuff. So we did an awful lot of nutrition stuff with them. We did a lot of measuring resting metabolic rates and things like that. And actually, you know, some of the stuff that influenced what I did with these guys, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the book Power by Fred Hatfield. And that is the book, the first book I had ever seen that was actually talking about performance losses as a result of making weight. Now, he was referring to it more in terms of, you know, strength sports, but it was really interesting where he actually went through, you know, if you're losing this much, you can expect to lose this much in the way of performance and stuff like that. And that had a huge impact on, you know, that book on its own was probably one of the most significant books that I read. And I think it actually, at the time, it probably wasn't as significant as it became later on. But it was one of those books, when you go back and you really look at it now, you can see how far ahead Hatfield really was at that time. You know, he was talking about things that even now we still don't spend a lot of time talking about. You know, stuff that we just kind of gloss over and don't put a lot of emphasis on. So it's really, if you get the opportunity to find that book somewhere, I would suggest that that's probably, you know, that for me, that was a more important book than a super training or something like that, because it really was a ground, in my mind at that time, for me, it was a groundbreaking kind of book, and really influenced a lot of the stuff that I did with, you know, these groups around the ideas of making weight and how to maintain performance at the same time. 2010 to 2012 is kind of when I got back. I kind of switched into full-time rowing stuff around that time. So starting in, you know, 2010, I moved to London, Ontario, and, you know, we worked through to a silver medal in 2012. And then I just kind of stayed on with this through till 2016. So that's a couple medals from, you know, the Worlds in the 2016 quad. This was from our World Championships in Korea. This is a little piece of what our training center looked like. And what we have here is, you know, for me, innovation is a critical part of what we need to be doing if you are working at a senior national team level. And what we have here is, this is a purpose-built isometric rack. And so what this rack would do is, the athletes could sit on the seats, put their feet on the two force plates, and they could do isometrics at different critical positions in the rowing stroke. And at the same time, we weren't looking at this as just being a testing device. Like, I think what has happened is we've gotten to a point in S&C where, you know, force plates are being used as testing devices and isometric is just a test. We did our training on this. So the catch position is like right at the start of the rowing stroke. And that is the critical position in the whole stroke. And that's what we were trying to measure with this bench. And that's why we mounted the TV right in front of the athletes, and they could sit on there and, I don't know, can anybody see the, does my cursor thing show up here?
You're good, Ed.
Okay. So these handles were adjustable so that they could be whatever positions they wanted to be, or where their hands were supposed to be. We could adjust this up and down so that their feet would be in the right positions. And then we would just do a lot of isometric pulls right from there, with the idea of, up here you can see, we would look at what are, asymmetries are occurring between right and left. We would be looking at a lot of rate of force development stuff, and we were really focused on the first 0.2 of a second was what was critical. And we found that this constant feedback that they got off of this actually made all of the isometric stuff that much more effective. But it all started out with, the idea for this actually came from the coach. Because the coach had this drill that he would do on the ergometers themselves that he called an erg hang. And he would just take a strap. And so this piece here where the handle is, you'd loop a strap through there, loop a strap through the handle, and over here on the ergs, you could do an isometric off of that. And he liked that as a drill, as a technical drill, to work on those kind of some of the posture in those critical positions. And he had a bit of an engineering background. So one day I suggested to him, I said, John, if you really like that drill, what would you think of building some sort of a rack so that we could actually do some tests on this and we could actually train this and get some numbers from it? And he just jumped all over the idea. Ran home, he had a CAD program at home and did all kinds of design stuff over the next 3 or 4 days, and came back with, he and I sat down and we went through 3 or 4 iterations of this rack here. But part of what that really, besides all of the stuff we were getting from the isometrics, and we were also able with this to be able to start looking at the relationship between what we were doing in the gym and our isometric strength in the gym, and relating it to, because we could do force measurements in the boat as well, looking at changes in force production in the boat itself. But what was really interesting about this was, or this whole project really became, learning from the coach and giving the coach some ownership in it creates a huge amount of buy-in. And that if they think something is their idea, they will be 100% bought into whatever you want to do. So if you find something that is valuable to the coach, that can also be valuable to you, you can get a big, big win with whatever sport you happen to be dealing with at that point in time. And that's what this was for us. Because we would also, with this whole setup, I would actually purposely ask John to come in when we were going to be doing these pulls in an S&C session, just to verify that the body positions and stuff that they were doing were right, and that they were the body positions that he wanted in the boat. And again, when we tie that coach involvement into the S&C program, and the athletes see both myself and the coach putting a lot of emphasis on something, they'll buy into it. They put in much greater levels of effort into it as well. So finding something that is important to the coach, I think, is a critical part of everything that we do in the S&C world. And then finally, our Rio Olympics. That's just a couple of shots from the Rio Olympics. And then post Rio, I went to CSIO and took over from Chaps as the S&C lead, and I've been there ever since. So that's it. That's the story.
Ed, that's awesome. A lot of meat to dig into there. A lot of great lessons along the way too. So we had a few questions come in as you were going through. One of the first ones was, where did you learn to lift weights and who did you learn to lift from? Can you talk a bit about the strongman side and the strength sport culture, and maybe some of the meatheads that influenced you?
I started weightlifting at University of Ottawa. Dave Ablack was my weightlifting coach, and he's still coaching. He's actually here in Toronto now, coaching. It's still the same club, Steel Machine Weightlifting Club. There was a good weightlifting culture in and around Ottawa. There was a good strength sport culture in and around Ottawa. So we had weightlifting, and there had been some good weightlifting groups in there. Aldo Roy had kind of been a big influence early on. I think I was coached by him once or twice. But yeah, Dave Adlack, we were at the University of Ottawa. We had a room at the University of Ottawa that, Trevor had sent something out to on a history of the Ontario weightlifting stuff. And by the time I got to Ottawa U, the room that had been dedicated just to weightlifting was now the university's weight room. And it was, I think, probably 3 squash courts. We had 3 platforms in there. There was only 1 squat cage, but we had 3 sets of stanchions. We kept all of our weightlifting stuff actually locked in a box because Dave owned all of the weightlifting stuff. And we had a pretty good group. At the time that I was lifting, Mark LeBlanc was a national champion, Canadian record holder. Akbar Purang had come over from Iran, I think, and had been a good lifter and was doing pretty well, on the national scene at that time. Martha Mason Ward, actually, this was when women's weightlifting was just getting going, and she competed at a couple of worlds, I think. I think she finished as high as 7th or 8th or something like that in the worlds in the early days of women's weightlifting. But the Ottawa Strong was a powerlifting club that was running out of one of the Ys there. That was a pretty good weightlifting club as well. And then the time that I was spending with Sandler, and we would actually, I started in weightlifting. I switched over to doing some powerlifting for a few years. I eventually got into some strongman stuff. I got into the strongman stuff when I was down in human kinetics. John Beatty was a nurse at one of the hospitals, and he ran a website and an equipment business called Fat Bastard Barbell. And he was one of the first guys that was making these, the homemade thick bars and grip tools and things like that. And the funny thing with John is he actually went on one of the first years of America's Got Talent and did a bunch of strongman stuff and, grip stuff and things like that on America's Got Talent. He didn't get very far. Apparently it's not much of a talent to do some of this stuff. But so I got into some of the strongman stuff through him because he did show promotion. Like he would put on a couple of shows a year in Champaign, Illinois and stuff like that. And so yeah, as far as other influences from the strength side, it was obviously those guys that we would be bringing into our Arnold, fitness expo. We actually, our Strength Pro business was based out of Las Vegas, and we were actually based in Mark Phillippi's space in Vegas. He's the strength coach at UNLV, but he was also competed in a couple of World's Strongest Man competitions. If you ever go back and watch some of the old ones, he's the guy that dropped the car on him and wrecked his knee. And then 2 years later was doing the Conan Circle thing. I think they were carrying a couple of motorcycles and blew out his other knee. But again, he had a lot of contacts with guys like Ed Cohn. And so, if Ed Cohn was in Vegas for any reason, he would show up at Philippi's place and we'd get to do a training session with Ed Cohn. We had Kaz out to a lot of our, Bill Kazmaier out to a lot of our events as well. And so you can't help but be influenced by some of these guys that were, essentially legends in the sport. At Philippi's place, Magnus Samuelsson would come by regularly as well. You know, so yeah, it's just a lot of these guys that were kind of the you know, world-class strength athletes. You could learn an awful lot from what they were doing, even if it isn't what was being done or what's showing up in textbooks and things like that.
I think that's a key lesson in general. People doing versus people researching and reading. So part of this is a lot of these names too, just throwing them out there so people can do their own homework, just to see who influenced a lot of you guys. I think one thing that stood out for me, I didn't go to my first Arnold till 3 years ago, and then I understood. Trev, I think, was telling me and trying to get people to go for a long time, and I never did. And once I finally did, I was like, oh, I get it. So I highly recommend going too, because you will not go to anything ever like it.
Well, I think Foley went to one of our conferences one year.
And 2010 or 11 maybe.
Yeah, probably it's one of the last ones we did then.
Yeah.
One of the other questions here for you, Ed, a few comments around your occupational side and the human kinetics side. You know, a few of our other OGs here did some private business stuff. What's your advice to a lot of the young people with around being entrepreneurial and how to get going with that, and whether it's multiple income streams, or you touched on a few things. Can you expand a little more on that for people?
Yeah, for me, a lot of it was because I have a really short attention span. So just doing the same thing, I could never picture myself just doing the same thing for like 20 years. You know, I always had to have something else going on. You know, and the reality too was you needed these extra income streams because there wasn't a training center on every other corner. There wasn't full-time S&C jobs, or there were very few full-time S&C jobs. You know, if you look through the early 90s, you know, actually through the 90s, there were very few full-time S&C jobs. I think anybody that was trying to put together a career in sport had to have other revenue streams coming in. And again, I was fortunate that, you know, the mentors that I had through University of Ottawa also had some connections with, you know, some of these occupational groups. Like some of the RCMP stuff came along because Jean Bonneau, who was the head of all of the fitness stuff within the RCMP at that time, had been a grad student of Al Reed and Jim Thoden, who were my mentors. And so you just kind of, it just kind of trickles downstream that way. But those were actually, they ended up being the sort of contracts that were relatively, like any government contract is a relatively lucrative contract. And so it was the sort of thing that over, you know, you get a contract with one of these entities, and over a 2-year period, you kind of knew that you had this base of income coming in. And then you could, you know, but multiple revenue streams is a must. You know, as a business piece in this, it's a must if you're going to be entrepreneurial in it. And I think if you're entrepreneurial and you're working for yourself, for me, it was always a lot more fun because you really have control over what you want to do, what you want to try. You know, at the same time, you've got to have the confidence that you can bring the money in or you're not going to pay the bills. But yeah, it's an essential thing to, you know, have multiple income streams. I think if you want to have any sort of longevity in this type of business, we just can't always count on, you know, government funding to do it.
I agree with you on that one. I hear you on that one. One of a few questions that we've given to our panel before, I'm going to ask you. Let's go to the people side of things. What's the biggest sacrifice you've had to make to get to where you are today?
I think it's been it's been somewhat tough to have any long-term relationships because I've moved around a lot. You know, to either chasing jobs, chasing, you know, training groups, et cetera, moving to where the work happens to be, et cetera. I've spent a lot. I've lived in a lot of places. I've moved around a lot. And so I think that's been the biggest thing with this, to do the things I wanted to do. It's required me to move to various places.
Live the nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah.
And what about professionally? What's the biggest thing you've struggled with professionally over your career?
I think it is ultimately the lack of money that was in and around the sports system for such a long period of time that really made it tough to, there were a lot of years where you sit back and you ask yourself, okay, should I just go off into teaching and get something that's safe and secure, and you've got a pension at the end? I think that has always been for all the positives that come out of the entrepreneurial side and being self-employed and all that kind of stuff, there's always that, when things aren't going well, when you're not getting, when there's less money in the system, when you lose contracts, when contracts are done, it's always that worry about, am I going to be sleeping in my truck for the next month, or can I pay the rent?
Real life.
Yeah.
I guess some people are definitely feeling that these days with no gyms open.
Yeah.
I definitely think we could just keep going. I think what we're going to do now is bring the panel back in and get to some big picture questions. So we got Sheldon Persad, Chris Dalcin, Trevor Cottrell, Ian Warner, and Steve Lidstone. I'm going to lighten the mood a bit. Given we're talking about history and 80s and 90s, give me your favorite 80s or 90s wrestler and why. Back when the glory days of wrestling, which is some great athleticism. What do you guys got?
Andre the Giant.
Why?
Just because he was so different than anything else out there.
Stole mine.
We're
talking real wrestling or the other wrestling? Come on.
WWF.
Or WCW?
The athleticism's real. It's the outcome that's not.
Ric Flair's got to be up there. Ric Flair, there was a guy who made wrestling. It's Ric Flair.
Why?
Ric Flair went from nothing and he built up wrestling over a 35-year career, or is it more than that? 40-year career in wrestling. He didn't retire from wrestling officially till he was almost 55. He lived, eat, and breathed wrestling. He was the ultimate obsessive nutball of wrestling. And he's the one who created the whole wrestling culture. Before him, wrestling was kind of a little bit backwoods. And then all of a sudden he brought it to the forefront. And then it was carried on through the Ed McMahon and WWF group later. That's my opinion anyway.
Chaps, I would throw in Jimmy Superfly Snuka. He was an 80s guy. Did I take yours? I did, didn't I? Sorry, Coach Warner.
Why?
It's just he was unreal when it came to aerial stunts and things that he could do. His body control, speed, power. He was just, to me, he had the complete package. It was by far one of the best athletes I've seen in the wrestling ring.
Ian, Chris, Sheldon?
I think for just pure energy. I remember taking the boys actually went to a bar to watch a WrestleMania, and basically who showed up was just amazing. But seeing the Ultimate Warrior come in, because everyone went nuts. He disappeared for a while, and it was just crazy. It was just crazy, man.
Just grabbing the ropes, going wild.
Yeah.
High energy.
I would add, I saw, I remember my dad took my brother and I to see Hulk Hogan against Ric Flair at Maple Leaf Gardens when I was a kid. And when Hogan came out, and this was when he was like the peak of his career, I've never, still in sport, felt a place shake the way that it did when he came out. It was unbelievable.
I went to WrestleMania 1 and 2, and like Coco Beware, King Kong Bundy, Jake the Snake Roberts, but my favorite was Andre the Giant because he's in one of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride.
Nice.
Hey, Chris, you remember when WrestleMania was here? A lot of those guys went down to the Gold's Gym at Young, right? Young and Bloor, and these guys were massive. Like, I think one of the Road Warriors came in, and the guy's arm was as big as my head, like literally. And then Roddy Piper came in, so he stuck to the script because he had some big guys in there, and they were looking at this guy. One guy's like, I could take you. And Roddy Piper didn't even drop his persona. He went straight to him, right up to his nose, and looked at him. Go ahead. It was great, man. Those guys were huge, though.
Mine's a little older than most of you guys. It's probably the Sheik, because he was, and think of the brilliance of WWE at the time. It wasn't even called that, I don't think. But there was the Iran hostages that was going on politically. I think there was the oil embargo, and a lot of things were going on wrong in the country. And this guy was put out front as an evil villain, and it just drew you to the TV screen. Saturday mornings, I can tell you. And this is the dark side of wrestling. He was the most hated person in wrestling.
Also known as the heel.
The heel.
Yeah. Okay, that's a little fun stuff. Let's get back to some topical. So for the panel, what is your opinion on being a generalist in our industry versus a specialist? Do you think specific advanced degrees in physiology, motor learning, biomech, psych, coaching, pedagogy, how do you feel about dual practitioners? So kind of three questions meshed together, thoughts and opinions.
For me and my trajectory, I would not have survived or been sustainable if I specialized in one area. However, we did specialize in a sport. So triathlon was a sport that we attacked, and we attacked it head on, from the late 80s right through till today. In terms of being a practitioner, though, again, it wasn't enough to be a practitioner just within a sports sense, but we have since day one, since we started our company, is we've done a lot of work in the corporate world, in the corporate area. So again, not necessarily just being a specialist within sport, being able to generate revenue in the corporate world is what really sustained us.
So a demograph or domain specialty too, not a sub-discipline of kinesiology type specialty. Yep, I like it.
I think, as I was saying right through my whole presentation, is you have to, I think it depends on the level you are going to be working with. If you are dealing with young development athletes who, what they really need is somebody to, expose them to strength and conditioning in a positive way and make sure that they are technically doing things correctly. I don't know that you have to have a specialization in any of those other areas. I think as you move further and further and further up the food chain, you have to have a specialization in all of those areas. It doesn't mean you have to have multiple degrees, because I think in many cases, graduate school is probably, depending on where you go, can actually be the worst thing you do for your career. If you're in a school where everything is focused purely on academia, publishing, et cetera, and the goal is to turn out academics, you can have all the degrees you want, but you're never going to be able to apply it effectively. I think you probably need one specialization through graduate work, but then you've got to self-educate yourself across the other disciplines. You know, you need to be able to, and whether you're going to be providing those services yourself, or you just need to be able to sit down and have a high level conversation to challenge somebody on ideas within these other domains. You need a high level of competence across all of those domains if you are going to be working at the top of the food chain.
I have the same conversation with my students and other people that I mentor all the time. Yes, you have to be a generalist first. You have to be an extreme generalist in our industry, and you should never stop being a generalist. You should always be trying to learn in every area that you can. But if you really want to build yourself up into a career, you have to become a specialist as well. So find a niche for you that you're interested in and that you're good at, and become really good at it. And that way, when we're having things like these S&C shop talks, or we're having conferences, you can come to the table and offer something that other people can't offer. And that makes you more relevant in our industry and makes you invited to that table more often. If you're just a journalist through and through, there's a lot of those out there. And it's hard for you to get to the table with some of these kinds of bigger conversations we may have. So find your niche, whether it's in rehab, nutrition, a sport, whatever it may be, or maybe a grad degree or research if that's your shtick. And build on it and continue building on it through your career, so you really become someone who can give back to the industry.
I would speak to the dual practitioner side of things, where, you know, for myself, I studied both therapy and strength and conditioning coming up. And I think the journey throughout a career takes you in different directions. And I think you spend more time in certain areas than others as you come up. But I would agree with the panel. I mean, a generalist to a specialist is really what we look at. It's somewhat like building an athlete long-term development wide, you know, like just putting them through a variety of sports in order to develop overall athleticism, and then let them start to specialize as they find what they truly are passionate about. It's very similar path when it comes to your career, I think.
Something Ed said, I think at the beginning, in his early education, the prof's direction about getting a great understanding of everything before you kind of pigeonhole yourself. I thought that was important in my life, is talking to the doctors and the nutritionists and trying to get a general understanding. But I've always thought myself as always a dual practitioner. There's a test I won't do to give me a better understanding of the sport and a better understanding of how I'm going to apply that testing to prescription and actually help the athlete. So I've never wore one hat, I don't think, in my life, just because of always running a lab besides training people, or training athletes.
Ian, anything?
Yeah, I agree with the panel. I especially like Steve's passion, because you get to a point where you realize there's something you like, and you'll spend some time and effort, more time and effort in that particular vein. So I agree with all the above.
Okay, so since you guys have seen more of this industry than the rest of us, where do you see it heading, and how do you feel about the trajectory? And whether it's a positive thing, negative thing, where does your brain go with that? Crickets.
Well, just as a point, the way you listen to news right now, you don't know what sport's going to be like in a year, 2, 5 years from now, just because this pandemic. Everybody's telling you we're going to have a world 2.0. It's just some things we have to leave what's conventional behind us. So I know that this is philosophical, it's general, but it's got me intrigued. I don't know. If you asked me a year ago, I probably would have given you more concise kind of projections, but who knows what's going to happen right now.
I think, am I cutting you off, Stevie? Oh, sorry. I think if anybody's been watching, you've seen what's exciting in our industry right now is we're actually at the pinnacle of being recognized for what the skill set we bring to the table, and taking on more leadership roles in that director of human performance, director of sports medicine. They're seeing that because of our generalist background and our contact time with athletes and our skill sets and our education, they're putting us in roles of more responsibility. And we're going to start being able to build these programs, and people are recognizing that the strength conditioning coach is a critical component of that if they hire the right coach. I also see at the same time the private industry continuing to suffer. Our private industry of strength conditioning, when working with amateur athletics or even pro athletics, is a cottage industry. It is not something you can do and be sustainable for long periods of time. Just doing that, you have to branch out and form partnerships with healthcare systems, sports medicine systems, and then good old-fashioned mom and pop fitness in order to survive. I don't see the private industry growing much more, other than you'll get a few rich investors who will open up a shop for a few years, run it as a loss leader, and then sell it off. And I saw that happen down in the States when I was there all the time, and it's still happening there. Doesn't mean it's not a quality product. It's just it's not viable on its own. You need to have that rich investor on top of it. So it'll be interesting with that dichotomy to see if the growth in that university system where you have the director of sports medicine will trickle down into other areas, say more high school strength coaches, that kind of thing. But I haven't seen too much of that trickle down yet.
I think to touch on that, Trev, I think, that's where I hope to see things go is at the collegiate level. Are we going to continue to have lead strength coaches and then like 2 or 3 overseeing a variety of teams rather than just one? That's my hope. It started to occur at numerous universities in Canada, at least in Ontario, but will it continue is my interest. And then also, you're seeing private high schools, hire a strength and conditioning coach, but I'd like to see more of a generalist high school start to hire strength and conditioning coaches and just see where that goes. So I would agree with what Trev said there. I think my question back to Trevor is, with your experience of what you did in the U.S., in particular with performance facilities being built at hospitals, do you see any of that coming north of the border, or is it completely a different situation down south?
Not in a cold day in hell will it come over the border. It's a shame. The reason why a lot of the U.S. Healthcare systems were moving to that model where they're joining up with sports medicine and sports performance is they're trying to encourage what they call end-to-end patient care. So you capture them when they're kids, they stay with the system forever. Their parents come in, your brothers and sisters come in and use that system. It's they call it eat what you kill model. So that's what they actually call it down there. So you don't make money unless people walk through your door, and every person that walks through your door is a dollar sign. The other push down there is with Obamacare and some changes to Medicare, there's a greater push for preventative health, such that for each person who enters your system, there's only X amount of dollars available for them. So if you keep doing shoddy treatments and they keep coming back, you're going to actually lose money. You're penalized. And so there was a push for some preventative health in order to get people, less using emergency rooms and more using alternative health approaches. Here in Canada, being universal healthcare, you would think that that's a preventative health model, right? So for every person we can keep out of the emergency rooms and out of the doctor's offices, we as taxpayers save money. But that being said, there's no strong connection between public health and the healthcare sector. The physicians and hospital administrators are not interested in that preventative health piece. The physicians up here are very protectionist of their operating room times and want to make sure there's a waiting list so that they don't ever have to go into the American model of eat what you kill. So not in a million years or in the model that we have right now are we going to see that, unfortunately, even though it makes complete and utter sense in the model that we have to involve more preventative health and exercise interventions. If you're looking just right now with COVID going on and seeing the relationship between obesity and what they're calling comorbidities, which is basically obesity or versions of it, and death rates, and then seeing the relationship between fitness level and death rates, it's just so predictable from our standpoint. But again, governments aren't going to back that up. There isn't a political push for that kind of thing because it costs money and it takes resources away from those people who run the system. That's my rant.
Sheldon, Ian, Ed, trajectory, thoughts?
Well, again, Chris hit the nail on the head in terms of what is to come is going to be a version of what was and what is currently existing now in terms of the world 2.0. And I mean, a few months ago, I wrote an article of the merits and the values of a 4-day work week and working from home once a week. And in terms of what it does to the cost of living, in terms of healthcare, in terms of, even things like decreasing blood pressure. So our industry is not going to be any different than that. And really it hammers home the point of being diversified in offering the services. And we're going to have to, we're forced to be able to offer our services in a diversified manner. And again, the world is going to be unlike what it was previously. We're going to have to be prepared for that.
Can I add
I
something to
agree with
mine?
Sheldon. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you can go first.
I was going to say, I agree with you, and I agree with what Sheldon said, and Trevor scared the crap out of me, so I have no answer for you right now, because we work together with a lot of people under one roof or in close proximity. What is that going to look like, or what are the rules of engagement going to be? I don't know, and I've been racking my brain trying to think, okay, how do I come out of this? And we don't know until we're told. Go ahead, Chris.
And Chris, I just want to reframe the question is always a dream of mine, and you have to look through, you only have to look through an NSCA journal, and on the back cover they'll show an ad by one of the weight machine manufacturers of a high school gym, and there's nothing even in Canada here at a professional level or a pro level that even comes close to it. And I always used to hear from kids coming up here that, at 16, say they're going to draft it in the OHL. They're all of a sudden they're 16 and they're going to play against men and they're just boys. But if you're in the U.S. system, there's right from the moment you're a varsity athlete in high school, you start strength and conditioning. If you've seen the film, I'm not sure if you guys seen the Netflix stuff on Maslin, Ohio, the famous football mecca. It's an important issue that the strength and conditioning coach for the high school is probably more important to anybody in that town next to the high school head coach. I always dreamed, but you made a point that it's coming up in private schools, but I always kind of dreamed that was going to start happening up here, that we'd build that same kind of model that you start learning strength and conditioning a lot earlier. Now we rely obviously on private sector to do most of that, except for some private schools.
I would throw that at Chapman and ask, his experience at Carruthers, and if it's a model that can be replicated across the province and the nation.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. I loved my time there, but I ran into a lot of barriers not being a certified phys ed teacher. And yeah, I left a bit of a martyr. I know Derek's there now and he's taken over. Just some of the battles I had, they wouldn't let me put a squat rack in because they thought it was too dangerous. And I showed stats and I pulled everything. Letting kids play basketball at lunch is more dangerous. Letting kids play soccer at lunch. And so those were the kind of battles I was having at the time. That could be a topic for another day, but yeah, I definitely think it's needed. I would have kids drop in before school, lunch, after school. I'd always have kids that would just live and drop in whenever they could. So I definitely think it's needed.
Yeah, but Chris, my daughter went to that high school after you left, but you sort of blazed the trail. They're not as anal, and there is equipment there that you recommended that they wouldn't buy when you were there, but they do have there now.
And then I talked to guys like Foley, who is a certified teacher who worked in a private school too, wearing both hats. I think that's a path that's also maybe even see more of, teacher/strength coaches.
Mm-hmm. Chris, we ran the HPT program, as you know, for almost 5 years. We didn't have a single physical educator enroll.
Not one.
Not one. And in all my Olympic weightlifting courses I've run, I've had 2 physical educators in 10. Well, I guess it's been over 10 years now. That's the problem.
Yeah, my experience dealing with that at a fairly prominent, it was a private school and I was a full-time strength coach. I didn't technically have any curriculum requirements or obligations or anything like that. It was It was discouraging. That was about 10 years ago now. But if I had waited it out another 2 years, it probably would have been to the point where we would have had athletic performance phys ed classes. I just patient enough, honestly, at that point, which I'm fine with. But it's kind of crazy to think that's where some of these discussions and us uniting and pushing some of that policy of the CSA, I think, becomes valuable because honestly, whether those people would want to admit it or not, or we would want to accept it, the sale of proper training to our phys ed staff was as difficult or more difficult than it would be to somebody that's not involved in physical activity at all. We designed a weight room that it was about 1,900 square feet, and I can remember literally once all the equipment was in, phys ed staff walked in and they were like, "When's the rest of the equipment coming in?" And I was like, "What do you mean, man? Like, we need room to actually do exercises and, train athletically and X, Y, and Z." And like, they thought that we were filling up the entire space with hammer strength selectorized. And that was in 2009, 8 or 9, one or the other. So yeah, it's certainly an area where it could and should be done. And I'm preaching to the choir now, but my sales pitch of it at the time was, we don't put every kid in the school in the same math class because they don't have the same abilities and they don't have the same wants and needs. Much the same, they shouldn't be in the same phys ed class.
Yeah, I would say to add to that, Jordan, I mean, I present every year at the Physical Literacy Summit that's hosted by Mark Verbeek in Hamilton. He's a big proponent for, branching out, transitioning, and crossing networks with all of our phys ed instructors across the province, or and there is an appetite. That's all I'll say. Every year, those presentations are really well attended. And the more feedback we get from the phys ed teachers, the more they recognize that their skill sets in teaching locomotion, speed, agility, change of direction, plyometrics, relative strength isn't what it should be for the kids. And so I think there's an appetite for it. I just think it's going to take some time, but I think the CSCA can be a bridge to that, and something that we can easily do in order to make sure that we're educating and offering, conferences, services to these phys ed instructors in order to build a more robust physical literacy piece for these kids coming up, and teaching falling skills, tumbling skills, rolling skills, wheeling skills. They're so afraid of having kids, in an inverted position, backwards locomotion positions. They've banned backpedaling at schools in phys ed for risk of like FOOSH or wrist fracture injuries, and simple things like that. That just I would agree with what Trevor said in the chat. It is immoral, and it is something that we need to get past. We can't bubble wrap these kids, Trevor said these kids aren't as strong as they used to be. They're not as robust as they used to be. I think as a society, we're getting weaker, not stronger by, also losing a ton of physical literacy. So I think that's a topic for another day, but I definitely think the CSCA can help bridge that for sure.
Jordan, can I ask you a question, Jordan? Was your mandate to work with the general the general student body or the varsity teams?
That wanted to, really. I'm not even sure if we had goals as an athletic department. Like, I always said that we were successful by chance, not by design. We had a ton of resources, and if we had any sort of structure behind it at that time, and the coaches that we had, like, we just would have been unbeatable at every sport. Like, the resources we had were unbelievable, but it was like they were afraid to be too good, to be really honest. So for me, like, in the first year, it was actually like quite a bit of a sales pitch. Obviously, football was in right away. I was actually an alumnus from that school of the hockey program, and like the hockey team didn't want to train, like that kind of thing. And they're like one of the top hockey programs in like the world in high school in North America. So, and then it was right down to the kids that didn't play sports that just rolled in after school and wanted to do whatever. So it was quite a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing that I tried to sell was strength and conditioning in high school. I think, anyways, the most important role is when those kids become 25 years old and they realize that they got to do something with their lives physical. They can join up to Good Life. They can roll in, buy their membership, and know something to do, and like not mangle themselves and get some sort of benefit out of it, because most people will continue to have the option to engage in fitness later in their life, but not everyone is going to be playing pickup sports to stay active and that type of thing. So that's a lot of it, what it was, Chris. And then by the time I was only there 3 years in that capacity, and then I left, by the end, I was working with like almost every sport in some capacity: soccer, cricket, swimming, basketball, even volleyball didn't really partake much, football. But at the end of the day, what would happen is the kids were driving it, because every kid was playing 2 or 3 sports. So if he was doing the football program and he was also on the basketball team, then all of a sudden, you know, they were training and that type of thing. So, but at the time, I think the only other guy really was Chaps as a high school SNC, and I would imagine Scott Vass was in his position out west, but his was in the form of teaching strength and conditioning classes, I believe. So it was pretty new.
That could be an interesting topic for another day. And Steve, you brought up the name Mark Verbeek. I think he's been one guy that's been a champion on both fronts. I know I looked to him back in the day when we were working with, I can't remember if it was Richmount, one of those academies back at Mac.
Westmount.
Westmount. So he's a name that if you're interested in that space, check him out. Trailblazing for sure. Ed, did you have any thoughts on the trajectory of the industry, where it's heading, and how you feel about it?
Again, I think all the COVID
You're muted,
stuff,
Ed. Sorry.
can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think all the COVID stuff is going to change things a little bit, but I don't ultimately think it's going to change things that much. I think by the time a vaccine or something comes around, very shortly after that, we kind of go back to normal. You know, I think the biggest thing with this, as far as the trajectory goes, it all depends on money. And I think that will probably be the bigger impact that comes out of, or the bigger negative impact that comes out of this whole pandemic, is just we're probably looking at some pretty severe austerity measures in the not too distant future, which would impact, you know, the ability of schools, sport associations, etc., to you know, make purchases of S&C kind of services. So I think we need to be looking at, you know, we may be stepping back to a time where people have got to be, you know, looking more at these multiple income streams in order to stay alive financially. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I think it's going to force people to broaden their scope of practice and their understanding of what it means to be an S&C coach. You know, I think it, you know, will force people to be more accepting of, or more creative in the solutions that they have to provide, as far as being willing to say, you know what, if they've only got money to see me once a week, then I'm not going to sit here and bitch about them not paying for me to be there 3 times a week. I'm going to do the best I can off of once a week.
Makes perfect sense. I actually personally don't like coaching all of the sessions. I like athletes having to consolidate the learning and coach themselves at least once a week, if not more. Panel, do you guys have questions for each other? Anything you've wanted to ask each other that we can all learn from?
I got one for Coach Warner. We tried to get him to speak a little bit more about his journey with his kids and developing some fast humans. Just want to know what, you know, obviously the highlights are seeing them compete, but, you know, what did either a quad or even just a day-to-day perspective look like in the preparation for their development? Just curious about your journey. I've got young kids that are aspiring athletes as well, and it's just interesting just to see their journey.
Us, Ian won't. Ian, who are your kids and what are their PBs? Because he won't.
10:09 and I don't know 10:16 maybe, but
Like 4.243 if they were to run a 40 for those of you sports people.
Well, see, my thing, I wanted to play football, and my wife's partial to track, so my wife won out. But I think the biggest thing, I had a client actually say to me, and actually, I can't remember his name right now, but the kid went to Crothers too. But the father came out to me, and one point he said to me, yeah, he's my investment. And literally my mouth almost dropped on the ground. What do you mean? Yeah, I'm paying all this money because I want him to get to the pro level. And that was hockey. I'm thinking like, what? And I've coached a lot of kids and with a lot of parents and from football standpoint. And the kids were so hard. I'm sorry, the parents were so hard on the kids. And it taught me what I didn't want to be like. It was their decision whether they ran track and played football. And I always stress to them, don't let a coach tell you need to specialize in either one. You can play whatever you want. And back in our day, we used to go out and play and, climb trees and do all kinds of things. So we developed the movement skills. So I never said to them, you have to do this and you have to do that. I said, do not let a coach do that. And it worked out well. Like the only thing that was a thumb screw for us was because football was in the fall and track was in the summer. If your marks aren't up to par, you're not playing the next sport next time. And we never had a problem with that because we wanted to make sure that they went through school, never had an issue, and they enjoyed it. But when football was over, they couldn't wait to get to track. When track was over, they couldn't wait to get to football. And I mean, it turned out well. I mean, I've asked them before, they've both gone down south in scholarships. I've asked them, would you do the same thing? Or were we ever hard on you? And they said, no, we do the same thing. And people actually thought we just ran their lives, but not even close. It was just a case of whatever they decided to do, we would support. And we were always at their meets or football games and anything else. We'd go down and see meets in the States. We were just always there. So a lot of the kids whose parents never got involved would almost look at us like we're parents. And I think I missed one football game of Ian's. And that was when I was coaching up in Scarborough and he was out in Burlington playing the Stampeders. And I was stressed because I wanted to see that game. That's the only thing I've ever missed. And it's funny, they always remember the things you missed. That'll come up. And a lot of times, especially in this profession, Dad, you don't know anything, or you don't know what you're talking about. You're too old and all that. But it gets reinforced later on when you realize you do know something, and you're connected with the right people, and you got them in the right frame of mind. But I think it was, especially being Black and being in the system, so to speak, I wanted to make sure that, listen, you guys should be leaders and not followers. Make sure you, lead by example. And having the athletic skills, they kind of were the leaders in the group. And I said, keep that up, but make sure, you rub off on some of these guys. And to this day, a lot of the kids call us and talk to us. A lot of kids I coached, and, it's still a tight circle because they realize that, us as a family, we're also out for the other kids on our teams, kids in the track teams and everything else. So, I mean, I think they got to own it. If I've seen too many parents wanting it too bad for them, and they'll end up quitting. They'll burn out, end up doing something else completely different. And they may have well been ridiculous athletes. But we never pushed them, never stressed. It's like when you decide what you want to do, you do it. Justin played football one year. He was begging to play football. I said to him, dude, the first hit you get, you're going to want to quit. Right? And I said, you can play, but you're staying the whole year. So he got murdered in one drill. Came home crying, I want to quit. Nope. You stay for the whole year. After that, you decide. He ended up playing, 9 years? So, You know, they've got to own it. I see the difference between that generation now and even our generation, that once you stick to it, you've got to make a commitment, do it. At the end, you decide what you want to do. That's really it. But don't push. Let them go.
It's interesting for us. I'll just close by saying, Doc Smith and Steve Norris, first introduced to me the long-term athlete development plan. And I was like, I without realizing it, I kind of put myself through it growing up, and I won't go into detail on that. But, with the kids, we're trying to put them in multiple sports, gymnastics, track and field, all those, like, just encourage school sports, clubs, just have fun and build athleticism right now. And what's interesting is it's the sports system that isn't allowing for that to be easy. The soccer academies are wanting the kids to do nothing but 12 months a year of soccer. And it's, having to say no to things like that is, it's perplexing to the kids because they want in, because the coaches want them, but we're trying to educate them on just, what a good, well-rounded athlete looks like and what it should be like to develop athleticism to a certain degree. So it's interesting.
So Steve, it's funny you say that. I've said to parents, so you're telling me, you answer this question for me, you're telling me if your kid is that good that they're going to cut him. Because I've heard people say, you don't play indoor, you're not getting on team outdoor. And I've said, no, if they're that good, trust me, they want to win. They will keep you on that team. But it falls on deaf ears, man.
Yeah, I've actually had my kids. I remember consoling my 7-year-old first time he got cut from a travel soccer team because we wouldn't do the soccer academy year round, so they cut him. So it's pretty interesting just to see, that side of sport early on in life. But that's for another day.
That could be a whole other interesting topic that we could dig into for sure. Panel, any other questions for each other?
I don't know how much time we have. It sounds like we're trying to wrap up, but I wanted to ask Ed, what didn't work to get his athletes strong? Because I know he was a big experimenter with many things. What didn't work to get your athletes strong and powerful?
What didn't work? I would say when I got sucked into, from time to time, different types of fads and things like that tended not to work very well.
Such as, Ed? So we actually, our first episode, we talked about the fads and gimmicks that came and went over the years. So curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I kind of got sucked into the whole core training thing for a little while. And that just really didn't end up doing anything better than squatting and deadlifting and things like that. So that was definitely, didn't work. Doing more didn't work. So, I've spent a lot of time just trying to figure out what is the minimum amount that I need to do to get them strong. Asking for extra training days from a coach, trying to extend training sessions from 45 minutes out to, an hour and a half, 2 hours didn't work. I would say those are probably the two biggest things, is just trying to do more than was necessary to do and getting sucked into the different fads.
I really like the question from Jordan on the group chat on just what's the freakiest thing you've ever seen an athlete do. I think the whole panel would be a great question.
Agreed.
I had a football player in the U.S., Ben Petrucci. His dad was actually the first man to deadlift 800 pounds in the United States. He was in his third year. He was wearing back then what you'd call turf shoes and a bodybuilder belt. And he full squatted 700 pounds for 5 reps. Beat that.
That's impressive.
So I was involved in, I don't know if anybody would have seen it, but in the mid-2000s, there was a TV show called Sports Science.
Yeah.
And you've probably all seen the tennis balls in the nuts episode, but One of the episodes we had Jason Zubak, who was a long drive specialist. And he drove a golf ball through the Los Angeles phone book.
I would say for me, some of the things I've seen, one thing I can't get out of my mind is Jason Burnett, an Olympic trampolinist, do a world record, flipping and twisting and turning and doing like just the skills that he put together and putting together the difficulty. I think it was 18.5 at the time, which I think is now being beaten. But he, at the time, to watch a world record set by an athlete live, just makes you appreciate the skills that they bring to it. Another one that I'll never forget is watching, a female broad jump 275 as a female hockey player, and making someone like Haley Wickenheiser drop the F-bomb because she'd never seen anything like that before. And, that was, I don't know, it was pretty amazing to watch just some of the things that the athletes can do. Female athletes in particular, repping out 16 chin-ups at the age of 16, for example. Terry Kelly is an athlete that just, I don't know, there's just things you see where you're just like, wow, I've never seen that before. And it just blows your mind.
Yeah, I mentioned mine in the comments again because of our involvement with triathlon. Lionel Sanders is a Canadian from Windsor who had a serious drug habit and issue and problems when he was actually at Mac as an undergrad, turned his life around and became he still is one of the best Ironman athletes in the world. And at one point in 2011, he completed an Ironman in 7:45, under 8 hours, which is unbelievable, and ran a final marathon faster than most of us could ride his bike. So again, for me, seeing a Canadian, a really humble guy that if he was playing hockey, everybody in the world would know his name. But to be a world champion and also to set a world record at an Ironman at 7:45 is unbelievable.
Ian, Chris?
I'd probably say the legs of Tom Platz. You got to Google that one.
I saw him in LA, Ian. The best legs in bodybuilding. My God.
Yeah.
And just for me, probably from a personal standpoint, just being in an environment in Sydney, Australia, and watching Daniel, Nestor, and Sebastian Leroux win the gold medal in a very, very, very hostile crowd because they took on the Woodies. They were defined. These were the top of their game. They were doubles champions for years, 2 Australian kids. They had told everybody this is the last match they're going to ever play in. And just to sit in the crowd and obviously the whole crowd was with the Woodies, and just watch the game change. They lost the first set and they turned it around, and it was history. But great crowd, great Australian crowd. More people that are Australian, you realize they appreciate good sport. They were more than appreciative of how good the Canadians played.
That's an awesome question, Steve-O. We could probably stay on here all day, but I know a few of you have to go at 4. So I do want to end with one question for the panel. Again, given you've been in this industry longer than the rest of us, what advice would you give to your younger self and those standing in your younger self's shoes these days? So if you could travel back in time 30 years, 40 years, what would you tell yourself that you know now?
Well, it's something I tell my students and whoever I mentor right now. Be prepared to give up 10 years. Give up 10 years. That's what you got to do. You've got to, whether it's education, internships, working for cheap, begging, stealing, borrowing. If you do that and you do it right and you work hard and you're good, then it can really grow into something. But you just can't, it isn't going to happen in 2 years. Some of us, it has, they're lucky, but you saw Ed's journey. You see, Jordan on here, look at his journey, or Sam or anyone else. It's generally, you have to just put everything on the back burner for 10 years. Doesn't mean you can't get married and have kids. It's a little bit harder, but you just got to live pretty skinnily for a while and put in that time and really buy into what you're doing and believe in what you're doing, and then you can get where you need to go. But don't expect it to happen in 2 or 3.
Great advice, Trev. What else we got, team?
Yeah, for me, it was, again, something I mentioned last week in terms of taking more business courses. I think Ed mentioned second teachable. So when I was doing my undergrad, my primary teachable was history, actually. I was working towards being a history teacher, and coaching was something I would do on the side. Going back, I would have actually changed all those history courses and taken some business courses. And again, just from today and the perspective of today, the advice I would say is just be patient. You know, do your homework, do your reading, do your research, but be patient. I find there's such a rush to get to the end or to get to a certain level, you know, in good time.
Yeah, I'd agree. I was going to say the same thing. I would have told myself to learn a little bit more about business. You know, there wasn't the marketing opportunities that there are now with social media and everything. And I think it probably would have been helpful financially to, you know, have a better understanding of what that process is.
I would say for me, you know, aside from those two things, which I completely agree with, it's, you know, put yourself through as much as you can in sport to relate to athletes. So, you know, in track, for example, you know, running multiple events, even gymnastics going even younger, like put yourself in those types of sports that help develop just an overall complete athlete. And then as I came up, I think I would have liked to have spent more time competing in a sport like powerlifting. I was lifting heavy, but I didn't realize that you could compete in it at the time. So those would be the things that I think would help a lot of our younger coaches coming up, is they're in such a rush to become a specialist in one area versus develop, you know, athleticism to relate to athletes if they want to work in an athletic field.
Chris, Ian?
Yeah, I think the business aspect is number one. Learn how to budget, learn how to grow your chickens, like just that aspect, because, you know, started back in the day, $15 an hour up to, you know, whatever now. It's like, but I think planning, preparing, now that we've been through something like this, it's even more important that we plan and prepare for whatever happens down the road. So I think that's what's missed. And yeah, with social media and everything right now, everybody's doing the marketing, got the marketing piece, but are you losing money? Is there a drain somewhere? So I think that's important.
Well, ditto on the business planning and financial side, but probably having the ability to probably say no a lot of the times. I was just, that was the way we had great facilities, great people. We had this notoriety, Olympic rings and everything at the Olympic High Performance Center, but people, you didn't want to say no. Yeah, and maybe it was selfish in many ways. If somebody was coming at me from a sport I didn't know anything about, I was going to use that to increase my knowledge of the sport, which long term I thought would make it more valuable, but you can't spread yourself thin. Yeah, it's, you know, I don't know what the CSIO kind of rule of, but working with women's basketball, and then you got your mindset, you're going to be working with 12 to 16 senior levels, but then all of a sudden they want input on their development teams and stuff. And this happened to me in swimming. I went to work with 18 kids, and yeah, and all of a sudden I'm working with 60, and you just spread yourself too thin. So the ability to say no is probably one of the things I should have learned early.
Sound advice, gents. A lot of that resonates with me. A lot of common themes there throughout the panel. That's been 2 hours. It flies by. I know I could sit here and do this all day and keep asking you guys questions. You know, you're all people I look up to, and it's for people listening in and others that may watch that don't know your stories and who you are. I think it's very important because you guys blaze the trail for all of us. And we're still moving forward. You guys are still around helping us become what we can be. So thank you for your time. I've appreciated this. Thanks for jumping in today, Ed.
My pleasure.
Panel, you know, that's 6 hours of your time that I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And, you know, we have recorded these, so I'm hoping that they can be used as resources for others in the industry and for people who are coming up. Yeah. Any last words from anyone?
No.
I hope this can continue later on when we get back to normal and you run these once a month or something like that. That would be great. Something like that. It's been
I
nice
like
for
that
connection.
idea.
Yeah.
Agreed. I like it too. It's our local community, and bringing in outsiders to join our local community here and there. And I'd love to flip the panel sometime and get some of you OGs to challenge us young ones at some point. Any other words from the panel before we call it a day?
Just thanks to Sam, Trevor, Jordan for coordinating initially, and thanks to you, Chris, for moderating. Awesome job, buddy.
Good
Thank
job.
you, sir.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
See ya.
Thanks, team. I'll make sure all this stuff gets circulated, and we'll be grouping together back to figure out some topics for next week. But I definitely echo that bringing something like this together once a month with your group and hearing your guys' wisdom consistently would be pretty cool. So I'll flip back with everyone. But thanks again, chaps. I really appreciate you stepping up to the voluntold plate there.
I love it. Let's change the topic for next time, though. I think we'll put a pause on this, even though we could do episode 4 to 10, no sweat.